Okay, let's talk about sound generation for a second. And we're just talking about basic principles of sound, just so that we get a foundation that we can talk about in the future. So if we've got a sound source that's small compared to the size of the wave it's generating, then the sound will radiate spherically. Speakers don't just radiate forward, they radiate in a sphere around the speaker. So the wall behind the speaker actually matters in terms of if it's reflecting the sound or not. That's why when I'm speaking and somebody's behind me, they can still hear me. If a source is large compared to the size the waveform generates, then it generates more of a conical. Let's say we had a wall of speakers, like a wall of Marshalls on a big concert stage, right? Then the wavefront that it generates is hitting the audience more like a linear wavefront, like an ocean wave hitting you, versus a spherical wave. It all has to do with the size of the source generating the sound and where you're situated towards it, because if you're sitting in the front row here, you're getting your head blown off by the massive sound, but you're experiencing it as like a wave front hitting you and aggressively hitting you. If you're standing over here, it's become more spherical as you move away from the source. So it has to do with the size of the source and how close you are to it. Let's talk about sound reflection. This is kind of important, especially if you've got a home studio and you're in a small room and sound's reflecting off the wall. Or let's say you like to sing in the shower. It always sounds good because there's reverb in there. It's because the sound's reflecting off the walls. So basically the sound that's coming into a wall is going to reflect off the wall at the opposite but same angle. Like playing billiards. You shoot the ball against the bumper and it goes off exactly the opposite direction at the same angle. The angle of incidence is equal to the angle of reflection. This is on a flat surface like a wall, but let's take this one step further. Sound reflection of concave surfaces. So I'm sure we've all seen this at like sports games where the guys with the headsets are like standing on the sidelines holding these big orange reflectors, right? They're like orange parabolic reflectors, and they're really cool because they've got a microphone in the middle and they're like pointing it across the field at the coach who's screaming at the player, and he can hear it all. So sound coming in and gathered by this is going to reflect off and go straight into the center. It's like radio telescopes, same principle. Very weak radio waves coming into this huge reflector that gets reflected to one point so it amplifies it and it can be detected. Now me personally, when I was a kid, I grew up in Chicago and they have a science museum there. And I used to love this one. On one side of the room they had a plexiglass reflector at least 100 feet, 200 feet away. They had another one on the other side of the room, and they had places where you put your feet and you face this reflector, and another person goes on the other side of the room and faces the reflector, and then you can have a conversation because the reflectors reflected the sound directly to the other reflector that gathered it and focused it right to your ears. So you could hear somebody just breathing and talking really quietly in a noisy room. It was really cool. That's one of those principles. And I actually, in my younger years when I was much more energetic, I decided this would be a cool thing to try in the recording studio. So I built a parabolic reflector, and I put it in front of a kick drum, put a mic in the middle, and I tried to get across the room and gather the sound and come up with some new cool sound. And it was a really good idea based upon these principles, how sound reflects. Diffusion. There's a couple terms to remember. Diffusion is hopefully the random reflection and dispersal of sound. This is used many times in recording studios. It's used in your home without you realizing it. If you've got a bookshelf and you're as messy as I am and the books aren't very orderly on the shelf, sound hits that bookshelf and gets deflected in different ways, and it doesn't really act like a wall. It kind of reflects different frequencies, different directions, and it sort of confuses a direct sound so that it doesn't reflect back and is noticeable as an echo. That's its sound diffusion. It's a really great way to treat a room where you don't want to put pads up that deaden the sound of the room. Still keeps it alive and makes it sound like a real room and not like you're in some sort of a little closet where sound doesn't reflect. But it doesn't allow sound to actually organize, to reflect back in frequency coherency. Let's go on to refraction. Different than reflection. Refraction is what happens when you go from one medium to another. Like let's say we're screaming at the orchid whale under the water, right? Sound travels through the air, goes into the water, and actually changes speeds and direction slightly. Here's a great example. It's called refraction. We're not going to deal with it much, but it's an important term to remember that it's different than reflection. Diffraction is a great example of me at a concert. I'm always behind the post and can't see the band, but I still hear the show because sound goes around obstacles. It diffracts around obstacles. So here you see here is a sound source, and there's an obstacle. If you're standing right behind the obstacle, the sound wraps around the obstacle so you can still hear it. On the other hand, if we're outside the concert hall and there's a doorway open, sound will start generating as a single point source from the door. Very similar to light, actually. In truth, light is very similar to sound in that if you put white light into a prism, it breaks it apart into its component colors. Just like if you take a sound, you can break it apart into its component frequencies. That's a good way to remember the spectrum analysis of a sound. It's very similar to light. Low frequencies tend to diffract and refract with more efficiency than high frequencies. If we're talking about an obstacle in the way of the sound, like I'm at the movie theater and there's this gigantic person sitting in front of me, right? The sound is like going around and I'm still able to hear the picture, the sound. It's because low frequencies are much larger than the objects that are blocking them. High frequencies, remember from last week, one of the principles we really talked about is that high frequencies are very small and low frequencies are very long. A lot of energy in low frequencies, less energy in high frequencies. So low frequencies are so long that they can wrap around and envelop any sort of obstacle and wrap around it much easier than high frequencies that get stopped by the obstacle. The inverse square law. Doubling a distance from a sound source means that the sound is dropping in intensity by 6 decibels.